In the year 1900, one of the most influential mathematicians of the age, David Hilbert, presented his list of the 23 most important unsolved problems of mathematics. The second problem on Hilbert's list asked for a proof that the basic axioms of mathematics can never produce a contradiction, and can produce every mathematical truth. In other words, the foundation of maths should be consistent and complete. It should contain all true statements and no false ones, and the negation of every true statement should be a false one. In the early 19th century, the leading foundation of mathematics was Bertrand Russell's type theory, but Hilbert's requirements had not yet been met. In 1931, a 25-year-old Kurt Gödel from Austria proved that they never would be met, that consistency and completeness cannot be combined in a single theory. Gödel revealed that the implicit self-reference within all sufficiently powerful formal systems entails that not all truths can be produced by a consistent set of rules, meaning that there is no such set of rules that grounds all mathematical truths. Gödel utilized an ingenious method of encoding that allowed him to insert propositions into themselves, and thus he was able to produce a statement, in the language of mathematical logic, which asserts its own unprovability. In fact, Gödel was able to produce through logic a statement analogous to the oldest known self-referential paradox, the liar paradox, which asserts, "This sentence is false." In mathematical logic, truth was considered equivalent to proof, and so Gödel's statement asserts, "This statement is unprovable," by the axioms of some specific theory. So, if we maintain that proof and truth are equivalent, then what Gödel demonstrated was that any possible foundation of mathematics would contain statements which cannot be simply true and cannot be simply false, destroying our common sense notions of truth and understanding. We shall come back to this point, but of course this was no good for logicians. For them, every statement is true or false. That's simply how logic works. And so they were forced to accept that what we can prove and what is true are not the same things. A radical and undesirable conclusion, and one which signalled the final demise of the then popular movement of logical positivism. This is because if we accept that truth does not always equate to proof, then a statement which asserts its own unprovability may be considered true, for if it were false, that would make it provable, and if it were provable, it must also be true, and this is a contradiction. Gödel therefore produced a statement which must be unprovable. And since its own unprovability is precisely what this statement asserts, it also must be true. Now, we might be inclined to conclude, okay, maybe there's something weird going on with how we understand the natural numbers, but Gödel's theorem doesn't actually affect our intuitive understanding of what a true sentence is. This would be wrong. Gödel's method of encoding actually shows that, in respect to a specific language, nothing we can prove can be definitively labelled as true. We can only call things true from outside of the language itself. Now, when we call something true, what we are really saying is that there is a correspondence between the meaning of a statement and the way things actually are. That is, a true sentence is one which says that the state of affairs is so and so, and the state of affairs is indeed so and so. If we want to claim that it is true that grass is green, the sentence "grass is green" is true if and only if it is the case that grass is actually green. For us to be able to designate this or any sentence as true, all of the true sentences of our language must be implied by the definition of truth within that language. But now, following Gödel, the Polish logician Alfred Tarski asks us to consider the potential truth of the liar paradox. That is "this sentence is false" true? Well, the liar sentence is asserting that the liar sentence is false, which is to say, this sentence is false is false. So, if a true sentence is one which expresses an actual state of affairs, it must be the case that the liar sentence is true if and only if the liar sentence is false, a contradiction. Let's do that one more time. A true sentence is one that says what is actually the case. So, the truth of the liar sentence, that is, "this sentence is false," is true, must be equivalent to what the sentence claims is actually the case. That is, "this sentence is false" is false. And since the definition of truth must imply all the true sentences of its language, and since all languages governed by classical logic cannot, under any circumstances, admit a single contradiction, no classical language can designate any of its own sentences as true. Thus, in 1933, Alfred Tarski showed that this contradiction is produced when we apply Gödel encoding to semantic notions such as truth, thus revealing that any formal language that can capture our intuitive notion of truth will be inherently self-contradictory. Logicians J.C. Beall, Michael Glansberg, and David Ripley explain, "Such things might seem to be mere puzzles, in the sense of games one might play, but they are far more. They show some very basic principles governing truth, indeed, principles so basic and obvious they might look like logic, might turn out to be false. Given the seeming obviousness of basic principles of truth, the fact that they lead to inconsistency, if we make some background assumptions about logic, creates a kind of dilemma. Either some obvious principles about truth, or some equally obvious principles about logic itself must go. In other words, for a given language, either the truth of any sentence is not simply determined by the fact that what it says is so, or one or more of the basic principles of logic must be false. In his remarks on the foundations of mathematics, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein emphatically came to the defense of our intuitive understanding of truth, and to the compatibility of truth and provability. But there are two ways to approach the assertion that truth must be equivalent to proof. The first is through a position in the philosophy of mathematics called Intuitionism, which was developed by L.E.J. Brouwer in the early 20th century. Brouwer argued that mathematical truths only exist within the human mind, and therefore depend on our ability to prove those truths. As such, Brouwer denied that every mathematical proposition is either true or false, since some propositions have not yet been proved or disproved, and perhaps some never will be. Things can become true or false, but before they do, they are neither true nor false, and therefore Hilbert's demand for the completeness of mathematics was misguided from the start. Intuitionistic logic therefore denies one of the basic axioms of classical logic, the law of excluded middle, which states precisely that all of the propositions of a given language are either true or false. The second approach is Dialetheism, which has recently been made famous by the logician Graham Priest. As Priest argues, the fact that we can see that Gödel's sentence, which asserts its own unprovability, must be true, means it must be considered provable. That is, again, because we can only call something logically true insofar as it is provable, and since we can call the Gödel sentence true, it must then be provable. However, since the Gödel sentence asserts its own unprovability, and since this fact contradicts the idea that it is provable, it must then also be false, and the Gödel sentence becomes a simple self-referential paradox, which is resolved by taking it as both true and false. As such, our mistake is that we assume that contradictions do not exist, whereas in fact they do. It is not that some statements are neither true nor false, but that some are both. Hilbert's demand for completeness holds, but his demand for consistency does not. And so, if we wish to retain an intuitive account of truth in our language, the two options we have at our disposal are to accept certain statements as neither true nor false, or to accept certain statements as both true and false. We refer to these options as paracompleteness, or incompleteness tolerance, and paraconsistency, or inconsistency tolerance. In 1936, Alan Turing showed that, insofar as a formal system of logic is essentially a collection of rules that could be mechanized, any such system could be instantiated as the hardware of a physical computer. He then went on to present his famous halting problem, which tells us that there is no possible computer that will be able to predict whether a program can give an output to any given problem. This is again a consequence of Gödel's theorem. When met with Gödelian propositions, the computer would become caught in an infinite loop. And, regardless of how human intelligence works at an abstract level, the neural processes of the brain are certainly governed by formal rules. These rules are clearly consistent, for else they would lead to physically incompatible events to occur in the brain. Accordingly, the lowest level of the brain should be describable as a consistent formal system, and so it must have its own unprovable Gödel sentence, just like Turing's hypothetical machine. Yet, as we have already established, it is immediately clear to us that any Gödel sentence is true, again on pain of contradiction, and so it appears that the human mind can see something that the brain cannot. Some mathematicians, Roger Penrose, J.R. Lucas, and even Gödel himself, have taken this point to imply that the human mind must be non-mechanical, and that it is doing something that no computer ever could. Indeed, Penrose, who is a Nobel Prize winner, mind you, argues that consciousness is that which allows us to recognize the meaning of truth, and so consciousness cannot be explained as a product of a machine. However, such anti-mechanist arguments take as a premise that the mind is a consistent system. Skeptics of the anti-mechanist argument deny this, that the mind cannot be described as a consistent system. And since Gödel's theorems only apply to consistent systems, the mind does not have an unprovable Gödel sentence, and the argument fails. Nevertheless, we cannot claim that we are inconsistent at the level of our neurons. It must be the case that our inconsistencies are riding on something, the brain, which is itself consistent. Lucas's response to his detractors is therefore that for the mind to be inconsistent, it must be inconsistent at its lowest level, which is impossible for purely physical reasons. But whether this is a valid response or not is not a point I'm trying to make. Even if it is not, and the anti-mechanist argument is flawed, which is a position I am sympathetic towards, it still leads us towards a genuine consequence of Gödel's theorem for intelligence. That is, for the mind to escape Gödel's theorems, and for it to be able to understand the meaning of the notion of truth, it must be inconsistent or non-mechanical, or indeed both. The way out of simply accepting consciousness as something beyond the brain leads us to an image of a mind of two parts, of a neurological computer, which is the consistent formal system, and an inconsistent program in which we find semantic notions such as truth. There must be some kind of correlation between the two, but the basic logics of each must be distinct. In his 1979 classic Gödel, Escher, Boch, Douglas Hofstadter seeks to demonstrate precisely this point, that human intelligence can be described as a consistent mechanical system underlying an inconsistent system whose ability to make mistakes also allows it to meaningfully interpret the world. At the level of our neurons is the raw power of our computational abilities, but only at higher levels does there emerge a meaningful interpretation of these abilities. While Gödel's theorem can be applied to the neural structure of the brain, it cannot be applied to the mind. Hofstadter posits that physical processes in the brain are chunked onto ever higher levels that are capable of symbolically modelling our world. At a certain point, symbols emerge that model the chunking process itself, so that human intelligence is inherently involved in a self-referential procedure. The top level, the mind, reaches back down to the bottom level, the brain, and influences it, while at the same time the bottom level reaches up and influences the mind. Hofstadter posits that self-consciousness itself can be identified with this self-referential process in which human intelligence comes to reflect on itself. And I think this is a reasonable suggestion, for if we are to consider the brain as objective and the mind as subjective, then consciousness itself would be a unity of the subjective and objective, which is precisely what self-consciousness is. It is the object that is subject to itself. Now, the idea of paracomplete and paraconsistent logics became popular after the publication of Gödel, Escher, Boch, and so Hofstadter does not attempt to draw a connection between them and the relation between the mind and brain, or as he puts it, between the software and the hardware. Nevertheless, if we are to consider the physical brain as consistent but incomplete, and the symbolic mind as complete but inconsistent, and insofar as there is a formal duality, a complementary relation in which the information on both sides is equal, the notion of non-classical logics appears to be incredibly useful and might just explain the structure of human intelligence. Just 4 years prior to Gödel's discovery of the mutual exclusivity of completeness and consistency in mathematics, Werner Heisenberg had discovered a similar limitative result regarding the mutual exclusivity of the expression of particles and waves in quantum physics. Heisenberg's findings inspired Niels Bohr's principle of complementarity, which he argued can be applied to all scientific disciplines, not just physics. Acknowledging Bohr's principle, the Brazilian mathematician Newton da Costa, who was one of the early developers of non-classical logic, argues that there is not just one true logic, and distinct logical, so as mathematical and perhaps even physical systems may be useful to approach different aspects of a wide field of knowledge. In light of the presence of self-reference in our logic, and in any wide field of knowledge, scholars have been increasingly compelled to look beyond our classical understanding for an adequate account of phenomena. Some logicians now outright deny that logic is a simple set of necessary rules. J.C. Beall and Gregor Stahl, for instance, argue that there are multiple valid interpretations of logical consequence, and moreover, that there are multiple valid ways to define the truth predicate. They write, "This is our manifesto on logical pluralism. We argue that the notion of logical consequence doesn't pin down one deductive consequence relation, but rather there are many of them. We should not search for one true logic, since there are many." Now, I could go on with this line of thinking, but I suspect that may be enough to satisfy you for now. The central point I wanted to make is that our classical understanding of the world has been progressively deconstructed. Paradox is not just a silly game, or a lack of understanding. It is a very real element of all comprehensive systems, and an understanding of paradox also requires us to understand the relation and interdependence of the opposites of our world. So too, Gödel's theorems are not mere inconveniences or limitations. They are guideposts towards a more inclusive and holistic understanding of logic and the notion of truth. And truth penetrates into all disciplines, not just mathematics. In Paraphilosophy, a new science of philosophy which seeks to explain the precise mechanism of the emergence of opposition in experience, the notion of truth, and logic itself, can be explained as a complex structure. And though paraphilosophy arrives at this conclusion in a wholly new way, it is not a new idea. In ancient Greece, the tetralemma describes a four-valued structure of truth values, as does the Buddhist Catuskoti of Nagarjuna. We are approaching an understanding foreseen by our ancient wisdom traditions, only this time it shall be built upon the foundations of modern rigour and analysis. If you are interested in understanding where all this is leading, you shall find in further videos on this channel that the absolute truth and the fundamental nature of our world lies beyond this complex structure accessible to the intellect, so that the nature of our dualistic, phenomenal world lies in the ability of consciousness to comprehend the underlying paradoxical nature of the very possibility of being.